Welcome along to another episode of Design Experience Conversations. It's my privilege to be sat here today with Thomas Robinson of Lever Architecture. Thomas, welcome to New Zealand.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, it's been great.
So you've been traveling with us this week across the country and seen a few things and a few different people. But obviously for those who attended the event, then they know what your story is. But for those who haven't had the opportunity, tell us about your practice and how it came to be.
Yeah, so we're a 35-person practice based in Portland, Oregon. For those of you who aren't as familiar with the United States, it's in the far northwest corner, close to Canada. And I think one of the things we've been known for is mass timber architecture and sort of innovation within mass timber. The firm's name is Lever, and the name Lever really comes from this idea that we think architecture can have a regenerative impact on the world. So thinking about architecture as something that impacts people's lives beyond the site that you're working on in terms of the materials you're using and how the material choices you make actually impact the wider community and things like climate change, things like rural-urban economic equity.
And how did you get involved in mass timber? It seems like quite a specific sort of architecture, but how did you get involved in it and how have things changed since you have been involved with it?
I mean, one of the main things is, when I came back from working in Europe, so I worked in Switzerland for a number of years, and I came back to the United States, and through a series of events, we ended up in Portland, Oregon, and Portland and Oregon is sort of the center of the timber industry in the United States. So you saw all this amazing material that was available, and we thought, well, how can we leverage that into, creating great places for people, but also connecting to the landscape?
One of the challenges that we have in New Zealand, even though we have lots of forests, is that building a commercial building, for example, purely out of timber, it has the connotation of being a very expensive building. But earlier in the week, you were mentioning how it is that your clients tell you I guess the story of what it is that they want from the timber and why it is that it's important to them. Can you talk about how it is that you overcome the barrier of cost when it comes to building a mass timber building?
I think the way we overcome the barrier is really kind of taking, I would say, almost a culinary approach to building, where you're starting with the ingredients, you're starting with the materials you have and the building culture you have and the place where you're living. And I think was very much the case when we started doing these types of buildings in Oregon about 10 years ago, is nobody was doing them. So you had to sort of think about what pieces can you put together in a really cost-effective way that creates value, as opposed to saying, hey, I have this design and now I'm going to fit timber into it. And I think that's been a really, that's why we've been successful in doing a lot of firsts, in the US relative to timber.
And what's the process that you go through for the likes of testing to prove that these structures are adequate and as strong, if not stronger, than steel?
I think we were really fortunate. In 2015, we won a national competition in the United States that was really about demonstrating that you could build high-rise buildings out of timber. And that came with about $1.5 million of federal and public-private funds to do the actual physical tests to demonstrate that was possible. And so those tests hadn't been done in the United States, and we were able to do them, demonstrate that you can do this type of work. And then that kind of, I would say, snowballed into a lot more work and a lot more folks getting involved and really engaging in that. And there were a lot of folks in, the timber is kind of a lifeblood to Oregon. So they were like very excited about this opportunity. And so they all got on board. And I think the same thing can happen in New Zealand. It just takes people really engaging in what's actually here and what people can do here. And I see that happening all around New Zealand. I mean, I see it happening talking to the architects and the engineers. And I think it's not necessarily visible if you're not in the field, but it's definitely happening.
And is timber the only type of product that you use in your practice?
Definitely not. We would not be in business if we just did timber. But I think the thing is because we're in Oregon and we're also working in the United States, is most of the buildings in the United States are built out of timber. You just don't see it. And I think that's probably the case with most of the buildings in New Zealand in terms of single family houses. So it's really leveraging that fact and then thinking about how you can actually create something that's higher quality and higher value. So, yeah.
Where do you see technology heading with timber construction?
I think you're seeing more sophistication in terms of how you fabricate these products, but it's sort of a chicken or the egg. You know, you have to have a market regionally to allow folks to confidently invest in the machinery to do these sort of more complicated buildings. So you have to sort of try to find simpler ways to put these buildings together initially, and then as people get more experienced, they can do things that are more complicated. I mean, it's like if you're going to run a marathon, you don't go out and run the marathon day one. You have to sort of take the steps to get there. And I think the same thing is true with these types of buildings and the industry itself.
And you mentioned earlier in the week that you were working on a testing facility.
Yes.
Can you tell us a little more about that?
Yeah, I mean, it's somewhat interesting because, 10 years ago, we were testing all of these types of timber components, and there just weren't that many labs that would actually do it. And now we have a federally funded lab or federal funds to do a lab that's dedicated to acoustic testing of timber assemblies. That's a big deal. You don't want to hear your neighbor through your timber floor. And then we're also doing a smaller lab as a part of Oregon State University to do fire testing that's really dedicated to timber. So a lab specifically built to do that type of testing.
And with the fire testing, do you need intumescent coatings, or is the timber itself enough to stop the combustion?
I mean, I think it's really, timber has an inherent fire resistance that's related to how it chars. And so very large elements of timber, which is what we're talking about here, mass timber elements, as they char, it actually inhibits how the fire. So it eventually will self-extinguish if that fire isn't incredibly hot. So it's a lot of a balance between the fuel that's in a building and then the size of the timber, so that it can actually maintain its structural integrity and actually then char to the point where it actually self-extinguishes. So it's not something I'm going to explain in this podcast, but it is something that, is something that we're testing very specifically, with these buildings.
You spoke also about integrating services into the timber as well. So I can't remember exactly what the project was, but you were talking about the V-shaped timber and how you integrated the mechanical ventilation into that.
Yeah, I think it's just more of a general sort of idea of what we're doing in that I have a background doing museums, and when you're thinking about a museum, you don't really want to see the mechanical systems. You want it to be integrated into the structure. So that's the sort of ethic we brought to, doing buildings out of timber. You're building out this beautiful material. You want to make sure that everything feels like it was designed and integrated. So we've sort of started with that ethic, and then we said, well, what if we can integrate the mechanical ducts within the actual timber structure? And that's sort of been the next phase, and that's what we did with the V-cassette system that I presented.
And what's next for Lever? Obviously, many, many exciting projects under your belt, but what's coming up? What's next?
I mean, we're fundamentally a firm focused on design and innovation. I mean, we happen to do a lot of timber buildings because we live in a place where everything's built out of timber. But, we love doing buildings people love. And one of the projects that we're most excited about is the Portland Museum of Art in Portland, Maine. That was an international competition that we won, and sort of bringing that ethic of, really beautiful buildings, amazing structure, something that is also sustainable and connects the community. If we could do that in one building, that's what we like to do, and we want to keep doing more of those.
And any projects on this side of the world?
Not yet, but I hope. We'd love to do stuff in New Zealand. It was great. We had a bunch of folks from New Zealand come to see an office building we did in Portland that we just recently finished. And they said, hey, we could do this in New Zealand. And so we're excited to kind of speak with folks, and we're talking to a number of people here in New Zealand about those types of projects.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for coming all the way over here to New Zealand. It's been our pleasure to have you here, and I'm sure there'll be many more questions that come about with mass timber in the New Zealand market as a result of that. So thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thanks,
It's been
Thomas.
great to be here.